Welcome everybody to John 23rd College, and you're all most welcome. Particularly welcome to visitors to the college. You know, these talks that we have are very much an outreach to the wider community, so everyone's most welcome. Now, I've shown about my experience in education tonight by the research that I've done, because it was really terrific to be able to look up Wikipedia. And so don't tell any of the students that that's what I've done tonight. And I'm sure Archbishop, you'll be able to tell me how accurate it was. So this is what I've read in Wikipedia. Timothy John Costelloe was educated in Melbourne at Salesian College, Chadstone. He commenced teacher training at Christ College, Melbourne, before joining the Salesians of Don Bosco in 1977, and graduated from Christ College in 1978. Professed as a Salesian in 1985, Costelloe was ordained a priest in 1986. After 3 years at Salesian College, he was transferred to Rome, where he completed his licentiate in sacred theology. On his return to Melbourne, Costelloe began lecturing in theology at Catholic Theological College in Melbourne. He transferred to Perth in 1996 and served as parish priest of St Joachim's in Victoria Park. Lectured at the University of Notre Dame, Australia, Fremantle. He completed his doctorate in theology from the Melbourne College of Divinity, returned to Melbourne in 1999 and resumed teaching commitments at the Catholic Theological College. During this period, Father Costelloe also held a number of senior positions in the Salesian Order. In April 2007, he was appointed as Auxiliary Bishop of Melbourne. With a strong interest in Catholic education, Costelloe has held a number of senior roles in the Melbourne Archdiocese, including being the Episcopal Vicar for Tertiary Education and the Chair of the Catholic Education Commission of Victoria. An adjunct professor at the Australian Catholic University, is also a member of the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference Commission for Catholic Education. In February 2012, it was announced that Costelloe would succeed Barry Hickey as Archbishop of Perth. More recent time, in Perth, he's been proactive in dealing with abuse in the Catholic Church and introduced the Archdiocese of Perth's Safeguarding Project and the appointment of an Archdiocesan Safeguarding Project Officer, together with representatives in each of the parishes. Last week I was privileged enough to be at the launch of The Way Forward, an initiative that seeks to determine the way in which we as members of the Archdiocese can walk together in the footsteps of Jesus the Good Shepherd. So tonight we welcome the Archbishop to John 23rd College to speak on the topic of Catholic education, what is the point? I'm sure you will appreciate, though it's quite a long introduction, how eminently qualified the Archbishop is to speak on Catholic education. You know, in fact, the very point that he is a member of the Salesians of Don Bosco is significant in that Don Bosco is a patron saint of people involved in education and with young people. So it is his very roots, the commitment has been made to education, and a lot of the Archbishop's work has been done in that field. So please join with me in welcoming His Grace, the Archbishop of Perth, Timothy Costelloe.
Thanks, Kath, very much for that. It's pretty accurate, I must say, the Wikipedia, so that's a good thing. I wasn't sure when Kath was starting off her presentation when she said, you're almost welcome. I wasn't sure whether she meant you're almost welcome or you're all most welcome, but I think she meant you're all most welcome. So I just want to reiterate that you're all most welcome. I wanted to begin this evening really just by, first of all, saying thank you, because this is a great opportunity for me both to come to the college. I've been to the college a couple of times for different things, but to be here and to meet some of the parents, some of the other interested people connected with the school is really an important opportunity for me. And as you will understand from what Kath has told you about my background, I am a bit of a fan of Catholic education. And I do want to begin just by filling out a little bit some of the things that Kath has already said, because I think it will help you understand where I'm coming from and why I'm going to say the things I'm going to share with you. And I think I want to make a couple of points also about that. We're all products, aren't we, of our past, in both a good sense and sometimes in not such a good sense. And that's very much true of me as well. So just a little bit about my own story. As you've heard, I was born and grew up in Melbourne. I was born in 1954, so I'm now a senior citizen, I understand, here in Perth because I'm over 60. I don't feel like a senior citizen, but anyway, apparently I am. So born in 1954, and I was born into what I would call a fairly typical, ordinary, not in a bad sense, but just a fairly typical, ordinary Catholic family in that period. So we went to Mass on Sundays. Mum and Dad made sure that my brother and I had one older brother, had a Catholic education, but I couldn't say that we were fanatics. We didn't spend our life down in the church. We weren't the kind of family, and I'm not saying this is a good or bad thing, I'm just saying it's the way it was. We weren't the kind of family who gathered every night to say the family rosary or always said grace before meals. We were more likely to be sitting in front of the TV having our tea than sitting around the table saying prayers. So just an ordinary, average Catholic family. But, as I say, Mum and Dad made sure that my brother and I had a Catholic education. I went to what I would think was, again, in the best sense of this language, a very ordinary, good Catholic primary school, staffed by an order of nuns that aren't present here in WA, the Daughters of Our Lady of the Sacred Heart. They're the kind of female branch of the missionaries of the Sacred Heart. So taught by them. I was an altar boy when I was in primary school, probably in about grade 4, I started being an altar boy. And then time came for me to go to a Catholic secondary school, and Mum and Dad had already found a school for my brother. There were 3 options in the area in Melbourne where I grew up for Catholic secondary education. There was no such thing as a co-ed school in those days. They were all either boys' schools or girls' schools. There were 3 boys' schools. There was St. Bede's, run by the De La Salle brothers. There was De La Salle College, also run by the De La Salle brothers. And there was Salesian College, run by the Salesians of Don Bosco. And the plain and simple truth is, we ended up at Salesian College because that was the cheapest, and that was all that Mum and Dad could afford. And lots of families and lots of parents would have been in a very similar situation. And it's not the topic of tonight's talk, but I think it's interesting to reflect on the ways in which things as mundane and prosaic as the economic situation of the family determining where you go to school are the ways in which God works in people's lives. Because had I not been sent to Salesian College, I doubt that I would have ever heard of the Salesians, let alone joined them. If I hadn't joined them, I wouldn't have been transferred to Perth in 1996 to be parish priest in a Salesian parish. If I hadn't been here from 1996 to 1999, no one over here would have heard of me, and when they were looking for a new archbishop, it would never have occurred to them to think about Tim Costelloe. So it's funny the way in which these seemingly coincidental or, as I say, trivial or mundane kinds of things are actually the way God works in people's lives. And while it's not the topic of tonight's presentation, it's a good thing for all of us to think back on the ways in which we are where we are because of what God has done in not controlling our lives, but through God's providence. So it's kind of a side issue, but I think it's important. One of the things that I discovered after my father died in the same year that I joined the Salesians in 1977, so I was only a relatively young man, 23. One of the things I discovered when I was going through Dad's papers was that he had had to put himself and the family into significant debt in order to find the money to keep us at school. And again, I think that's very typical of many families who make big sacrifices to send their sons or daughters to schools that they believe are the best schools for their children. And I'm sure there are many parents here at John the 23rd who are in a similar kind of situation. When you're a young person, when you're a kid, you don't necessarily reflect on all of this, but when you get a bit older, you do look back and you think about how important it was to Mum and Dad that my brother and I should have a Catholic education, when they could just as easily have sent us to the local high school. So again, that dimension of faith, I suppose, is a fairly important one. I finished Year 12 in 1971, and I really didn't know what I wanted to do. I had an idea in the back of my mind that maybe I would be a priest, but it hadn't really coalesced at that time. I didn't know what I wanted to do. If any of you have got sons or daughters in Year 12, you probably don't want to tell them this, but in those days you had to get a scholarship or pay fees to go to uni. I was lucky enough to get a scholarship. So I went from Year 12 straight into uni, didn't know what to do, just decided to do the same subjects I'd done in Year 12, hated every minute of it, and within 6 months I dropped out of uni, so I'm a uni dropout. Then I started doing all kinds of things. I worked in menswear for a while, I looked around for different jobs, really couldn't settle. Mum and Dad were starting to panic a bit, so they convinced me to sit for the public service exam, which I did. So I joined the public service. I promised Mum and Dad that I would stay there for at least a year. So on the day that the year was up, I resigned from the public service because I absolutely hated it. So Mum and Dad started to get a bit panicky again. But through all of this, it was gradually becoming clearer to me that I should do what I'd always wanted to do right from when I was a little kid, and that was become a teacher. And because I had been to Catholic primary and secondary schools, because the faith mattered to me, it was important to me, I still, one of those strange people who when they turn 17 or 18 still keep going to Mass. So I was still going to Mass, so it was natural for me to go to a Catholic teachers' college. So I enrolled at Christ College, which is was a primary teachers' college, and I really enjoyed my time at college. The problem was, not the problem, again, this is the way God works these things out, the reality was that was the same college that Salesians were sent to do their teacher training. So it kind of put me back in touch with the Salesians. They were just young guys like me, and they were good blokes, and they were friendly, and I got to know them. And so my time at school kind of came back to me. And I think that kind of resurfaced this thought that I thought I wanted to be a teacher, maybe I should be a priest instead. And I'm a bit slow, it takes a while for the penny to drop. So I finally realised, hello, you could be a Salesian, then you can be a teacher and a priest all at the same time. So I decided to join the Salesians. So 2/3 of the way through my course, I interrupted the course, joined the Salesians, and then went back and finished the primary teacher training course. I taught primary school for 1 year. I was a grade 3 and 4 composite teacher and absolutely hated it. So I survived the year and immediately moved into the secondary system and started teaching in one of our big secondary schools. And my big ambition was to be Year 7. Year 7 was always the first year of high school in Melbourne. To be a Year 7 English and RE homeroom teacher. That was my big ambition. And I achieved that for a couple of years. But then, as inevitably happens, and many of you are very familiar, all of you probably, with the way schools work, I gradually got asked to do more and more, and eventually ended up as the religious education coordinator of this school, which was a boys' school of about 900 boys from Year 7 to Year 12. So I had that role for a number of years, and that was, I loved that time. I really enjoyed that time. But the leader, the provincial of the Salesians at the time, said we need someone who can go overseas, do some further study, come back and teach theology in the theological college, because that's where the young Salesians go to learn their theology. So I was asked to go to Rome. I lived there for 2 years and did a licentiate, it's like a master's degree in theology. Came back to Melbourne and basically was put into the theological college, started teaching theology, and then gradually got more and more involved in the formation, the training of young men who wanted to be Salesians. So that was my life. I was very happy doing all of that. I also was gradually getting drawn into the life of the Archdiocese in Melbourne. The Archbishop had put me on the Council of Priests. I was the spiritual director for a number of the diocesan seminarians. I was giving retreats to the priests from time to time. So I was gradually also being drawn into the life of the diocese. And then in 2007, then I came over here, of course. In 1996, I was transferred over here. So I was parish priest at Victoria Park, teaching theology at Notre Dame, and that's when I also completed my doctorate. I was here for 4 years, then went back to Melbourne, picked up the teaching. I was very happily doing all of that, and then in 2007, I got the dreaded phone call. So at the time, amongst the many jobs I had, I was the chair of the school board of Salesian College, the place where I went to school as a boy and the place where I also taught. So I've just about done... If you want to know anything about that school, I can tell you about that school. Most of my life's been at that school. I was the chair of the board, so at the end of the day when I'd done all my teaching, I rushed out to attend the board meeting, and in fact I turned up a little bit early, so I went down to the local shopping centre, you know, like Garden City, but this was Chadstone Shopping Centre, to get a cup of coffee, and I thought I'd better check my mobile phone because I haven't looked at it all day. This was about 4:45. And I checked the messages and there was this voice on the other end saying, "Father Costelloe, it's the Apostolic Nuncio ringing from Canberra. Can you please ring me when you get this message?" And he'd rung at 10 o'clock in the morning. And when the Nuncio rings, you don't really want to keep him waiting. I presume you know the Nuncio is like the Pope's ambassador here in Australia. So I rang him up and the secretary put me through and he said to me, "Oh, Father Costelloe, I've got some news for you." And I said, "Oh yes, what's that?" He said, "The Holy Father has appointed you as an auxiliary bishop in Melbourne. Not the Holy Father would like to ask you if you'd like to be an auxiliary bishop, or the Holy Father's thinking of this. The Holy Father has appointed you." So I won't go into all of the details of it, but that's how I became a bishop. And then I was there from 2007 until 2012, when I was appointed as the Archbishop here. And as you've heard, during that time, I have been pretty heavily involved in Catholic education. So I'm trained as a teacher. I've taught both primary and secondary and tertiary. And I've had a number of roles in education. So I'm not saying that to kind of big note myself, but simply to say, when I speak about Catholic education, I speak not just from experience, but from a great love of Catholic education. I've said to people before that I don't think you'll find a bishop in the country who's more committed to Catholic education or more in favour of Catholic education or more admiring of Catholic education than I am. But I'm also very realistic about its weaknesses and its challenges. It has enormous strengths, as we all know. This college has enormous strengths, as we all know. And whilst we recognise that, we also have to be realistic about the fact that Catholic education has challenges and it's doing its best to meet them. I'm not really here tonight to focus on the challenges, but what I wanted to do tonight is respond to the question, which we know is the topic of tonight's talk: Catholic education or Catholic schools, what's the point? The first thing I'd say is that it's just a subset of the question, education. What's the point? And you could all answer that question just as well and probably better than I can. Those of you who are parents, and I guess that's all of you or most of you, you know why education is important. You know what the point of education is. But tonight I wanted to focus on the two words together: Catholic education. What's the point? And the first thing I want to say, and I think it's a really important thing to say, is that, and I'll repeat it as we go through probably, a Catholic school can't be a good Catholic school if it's not a good school. I think that's a really important thing to say. Parents send their children, their young people to school because they want the best education they can possibly provide for their children. Parents have a right to expect that the school that they choose will be the very best school it can possibly be. And the religious dimension of the school, which is what I want to focus on tonight, should never be used as an excuse for it being second-rate in other areas. But nor should the fact that it's a school be used as an excuse for it being second-rate in those dimensions of the school which make it Catholic. So while I'm talking a lot about the Catholic identity tonight, I don't want you to think that it's the only thing I as the Archbishop thinks matters. We're talking about education. We're talking about schools. And I as the Archbishop want our schools to be the best educational institutions they can possibly be. And Tim MacDonald, the Director of Catholic Education, knows that because I say it to him every time I get the chance. And he agrees with me, obviously, as all of you would too. So that's the first thing that I wanted to say. But certainly in my role as a bishop, both in Melbourne and now here in Perth, I'm often asked to talk about Catholic education and about the Catholic identity of a Catholic school. And when I think about the question, Catholic schools or Catholic education, what's the point? I'm really thinking that people are asking me to reflect on the Catholic identity of the school. What makes a school Catholic? Now, it might seem very obvious, but I don't think it's quite as obvious as people sometimes think. As you're all aware, here in Western Australia, like everywhere else in the country, the Catholic Church invests enormous resources, energy, time, commitment into Catholic education. And we do it very, very well. Our schools are very much sought after. Many schools, possibly yours as well, have long waiting lists because everyone's desperate to get their kids into the school because of the reputation of the school, because of the quality of the school. So we're doing something right. And it's interesting to ask, and this is the question that I want to explore and examine a little bit tonight, it's interesting to ask, what is it that we're doing right which makes our schools, with their unique characteristics and aspects, so attractive to people? And I want to say that it's the Catholic identity of the school, properly understood, that makes our schools so attractive. And I want to explore that a little bit tonight. I think it's worthwhile, just at the start, reminding ourselves in a very general way, and this is very much a potted history of Catholic education in Australia, and therefore not terribly accurate except in a very broad brush kind of way. It's good for us to remember how Catholic education got started in Australia, way back in the 1970s, more or less. Certainly the famous Education Act of 1872. Did I say 1970s? I mean 1870s. The Catholic Education, the Victorian Education Act of 1872 established education as free, compulsory and secular. And it was that decision and the ways that decision was kind of duplicated in other parts of Australia at the time and around that period in history, which led the bishops of the church, the Catholic bishops, to make the decision that they were going to establish a separate education system. It wasn't because they didn't agree that education should be free. It wasn't because they thought that education shouldn't be compulsory. It was because they didn't think that education should be secular. And I think that's really important for us to remember. 1872 is very different from 2015. I know that, and there's a long history and many developments that have taken place. But the original impulse for the establishment of Catholic schools was because the Catholic bishops, and they would have had the people with them in this, didn't believe that a secular education, that is an education, this was the way it was conceived in those times, an education that excludes the spiritual and religious and that dimension of life. They didn't believe that a secular education was what they wanted for their children. And of course it was the decision of the bishops to try and establish a Catholic education system that led to the bringing into the country of so many of the religious orders. Not so much, I don't think, at that time, orders like the Jesuits or the Loreto sisters, who are so important in your own history, but orders like the Mercy Sisters, the Christian Brothers, and then a little bit later some of the other teaching orders. And if you would all know Perth better than I do, if you think about the schools all across the diocese, how many of them, both primary and secondary, owe their origins to a religious order who was the foundation of the school. So it's just good to remind ourselves of that. It was really in the 1960s and 70s that the government, the federal government, began to provide some funding for Catholic schools, because the Catholic schools would have collapsed without it. The religious were no longer as present as they used to be, and the system was growing, and it was just impossible. Certainly when I was at school, I started primary school in 1960, probably 1959, that's a long time ago, and went through primary and then secondary, finishing in 1971. When I started school, most of the staff were religious. By the time I finished school in Year 12, there was only a handful of religious and most of the staff were lay people. The reason why that was able to happen, and the reason why the system has expanded and grown in the way it has, is very largely, perhaps almost exclusively, because of government funding. And as you would know, our Catholic education system, I don't have the figures in front of me, but it's funded perhaps as high as 90% by federal and state government grants. Would it be that high? You're not sure? Yeah, generally speaking, I'm talking about. So across the whole system, it's something like that. So that might include the contribution of parent fees, but there's a very significant contribution of government funds, obviously. I think that long history of Catholic education and the original impulse for the establishing of Catholic education can help us as we try and understand how we might answer the question, Catholic schools, what's the point? The other statistic that you might be interested in, you may know it already, is that at the moment I think it's 1 in 5 Australian children is educated in a Catholic school. It's an enormous contribution which Catholic education makes to our country and to our society. Behind all of this, and looking at the history and the present situation today, one of the things I think is really important for us to grasp is that Catholic schools, including John the 23rd College, are a work of the Church. If there were no Catholic Church here in Western Australia, there would be no John the 23rd College. There might be a school on this site, but it wouldn't be John the 23rd College. They certainly wouldn't be naming it after a dead pope if it wasn't a Catholic school. So Catholic schools are a work of the Church. And they cannot in fact, and I'm not just saying this because I'm the bishop, but they cannot in fact continue to operate in a diocese without the agreement of the bishop, because that's the way the Church is structured. In our Catholic understanding, I was saying this to a group of people the other day, how do you not get to be a Catholic? You get to be a Catholic by being baptised. But basically in the Church's understanding, you become a Catholic by being baptised into a local Catholic community called a parish. And that community is only a Catholic community because that parish, together with its priest, are in communion with the bishop of the diocese. And that diocese is only a Catholic diocese because the people and priests of the diocese in communion with their bishop are in communion with the Bishop of Rome. That's the way the Catholic Church is put together. So to say that this school or any Catholic school is a work of the Church is a very important thing for us to understand. Certainly the bishop doesn't exercise day-to-day control over a school, but the school has to be faithful to the Catholic thing if it's to continue to be a Catholic school and continue to have the support of the Church. So that raises the question, and I think it's a question that I would like all of us to be thinking about. What makes John the 23rd a Catholic school? What gives it its Catholic identity? And just as we can ask it about this college here, we could ask it about any of our schools in the diocese. I often speak about this to different groups. Often principals will ask me to speak, when there's perhaps an intake of new school principals, I'm often trotted out to talk about this sort of stuff. Or when I go and give an in-service day to a school staff or something like that. And I always put the question to the principals or the staff of the CEO or whoever it might be. What makes your school Catholic? And then I'm not going to do it now, but I invite answers. And my experience is that almost universally the responses begin with some reflection on what people are very happy to call the pastoral care of the school. Our school's a Catholic school because our school has a fantastic pastoral care program. Our school really cares for the students that come here. And I would hope that's true. I'm sure you as parents would hope that's true. Why would you let your kids come here if they weren't being well looked after? But I then challenge the people, whether it's the principals or the teachers or whoever else it is, and say, if you were to go down the road to the local government high school and suggest to them that they didn't care as much about their kids as you care about your kids, they would be probably very angry and very insulted, and rightly so. Any school that wants to be a decent school will care about the children, the young people who come there, and put in place structures and systems which will make sure those kids are cared for. Many schools even call it, many government schools even call it a pastoral care program. The word pastoral, of course, comes out of the Christian context, but it's now a very widespread word. You hop on the websites. I've often said this, and I thought I'd better go back and check again in case I've just made this up in a dream or something. So I checked a lot of government school websites, and that's what I found. Often it's very specific, pastoral care programs. Often it's there in practice, although they don't use that title. So I say to the people, of course a good Catholic school will have an excellent pastoral care program. You couldn't be a decent Catholic school without a good pastoral care program. But on its own, it won't make you a Catholic school. And so then I push people to reflect on this a little bit more deeply. And the answer that almost universally would come up next is, well, the thing that makes us a Catholic school is that our school is based on gospel values. And of course, it would have to be that way, wouldn't it? You couldn't imagine a Catholic school that's not based on gospel values. At least I hope we couldn't. And certainly the school down the road, the government school, wouldn't be allowed to say, wouldn't want to say that it's basing itself on gospel values because government education is secular. So then I ask the teachers or the principals, whoever it is, to tell me about these gospel values. I didn't check your website, so you can go and have a look at it later on. But more often than not, the gospel values will be things like tolerance, understanding, inclusiveness, opportunity for all, acceptance, forgiveness, and they're all gospel values. But they're gospel values because they're deeply human values. If the gospel isn't rooted in the reality of what it is to be human, then we ought to forget about our religion altogether and go home. Gospel values, generally speaking, are deeply rooted human values, so of course they're going to be found everywhere. Well, not everywhere, but in many places. So again, I did check. I looked at Catholic school websites here in WA, and I looked at government school websites here in WA, and while it's a bit more explicit on a Catholic school website, often the list of values is exactly the same. And that's not a bad thing. I'm not criticising that at all. But what I'm trying to say is that if a Catholic school puts all its Catholic identity eggs in the basket of pastoral care, or in the basket of gospel values as they're generally understood, I would say again, of course it can't be a decent Catholic school without those things, but on its own, it won't make a school Catholic. So people start to get a bit uneasy then and shifting in their seats and think, well, I wonder where he's going with all of this. So I pushed them a little further, and of course, obviously, the whole God thing then comes into the picture. And I'm quite fond of using that phrase, the God thing. A Catholic school will have fantastic pastoral care programs, will be based on these very wonderful values, which we would identify as gospel values, but it will also be, and has to be, a place where the God thing features. And that's the thing that will make it distinctive and distinguishable from the government school down the road, because if the government school down the road was pushing the God thing, the parents would be up in arms and they'd shut the school down, because government education is meant to be secular, non-denominational, non-religious. The thing that's unique about Catholic education is that it takes the God thing seriously. And then I would say to a school, and I would say to all of you gathered here tonight, those who are part of John the 23rd and those who perhaps are involved in other schools, how does the reality of the God thing make itself manifest in your school community? But then, once I've got to that point, and I think generally, certainly people involved in Catholic education, teachers and principals, they recognise that what I'm saying makes sense. I then push them a little further. Because I say, if we settle on the God thing, and we went around the corner to the local Muslim college, they would have the God thing probably even much more explicit than we have it in ours. If we were to go to the local Jewish school, the God thing would be very central in their school. So the God thing just generally isn't going to quite cut it. So then, of course, people go, well, it's the Jesus thing. Somehow or other, it's got to be the Jesus thing that is the unique thing about our school. Now, I think once we're heading down this path, people are right. These are the things that will make a Catholic school Catholic. Because for Christians, God has made himself known fully and finally in Jesus. That's what we believe as Christians. If you want to know what God's like, if you want to really grasp as much as we can what God is like, then have a look at Jesus and you'll see. That's what we believe. So that's good, and everyone's feeling comfortable about that. And most teachers in Catholic schools and most principals, and I would hope many of the families, are happy to say, well, we're quite happy for the Jesus thing to be at the heart of the school in one way or another. But then I say, well, you know, Guildford Grammar would have the Jesus thing going on. I presume I don't know much about the Anglican schools here in Perth, but at least in name, and I'm only saying that because I don't know the reality of the schools, but schools that are associated with the Anglican Church or the Uniting Church or Methodist Ladies College or whatever it might be, they will have the Jesus thing present in their school. Now, in saying all of this, I hope I'm not coming across as if I want to be kind of sectarian, because I'm not. But I think we then have to push a little harder and say, well, it's the Jesus thing as it's understood and lived and experienced within the Catholic tradition. That's what's going to make the school a Catholic school. But remember what I said at the start. It won't be a good Catholic school if it's not a good school. So I'm not saying get the Catholic thing right, it doesn't matter about any of the rest. It's got to be a good school. But it won't be a good Catholic school unless the question of God revealing himself through Jesus and experienced in the life and tradition of the Catholic Church, unless that's there somehow or other as an animating spirit in the school will be struggling to be a good Catholic school. I'm hoping that this is sort of making sense to people. I'm going to finish soon. I'm not sure how long I was supposed to talk. You should never have let me start without telling me when to stop. It was a bad mistake. I'm going to finish just with this thought, because I think this can perhaps flesh that out a little bit. You know that there's a lot of controversy around at the moment about issues around, for example, same-sex marriage and all of those kinds of things. And, you know, we're facing all sorts of questions. We've faced them for years about whether or not a Catholic school is a school that teaches Catholic doctrine, a school that invites the kids, makes the kids, whatever you do in your school, go to Mass occasionally, makes them say a prayer from time to time, sends the Year 12s away on a retreat at the start of the year. Has it got those Catholic things in it? And if you can tick off the box, well, yeah, we have a few RE classes each week, and we have a liturgy once a term, and we have retreats every so often, and we invite a priest to come in every now and then to celebrate the sacrament of reconciliation. So we've ticked the Catholic boxes. We've done the Catholic things. I don't think that's what a Catholic school is. You'll need those things. They're part of the whole package deal, so to speak. But I think a Catholic school is a place where the Catholic worldview, and I'll explain what I mean about that in a minute, the Catholic worldview permeates the school. So it's not about the Catholic identity being confined to what happens in the RE class. It's about the atmosphere of the school. It's about the ethos of the school. It's about the total environment which envelops your children when they come into the school. What I'm really talking about is the way in which we put together our answers to the question, what's life all about? Now, there's a Catholic way of putting those ideas together. It's not unique to us. Most of the features of the way we would put it together will be indistinguishable from anybody else's understanding of these things. But I'll give you a little example. It's nothing to do with the doctrines and things like that, really. They're important, don't get me wrong. But years ago, some of you may remember this, there was an ad on TV, I think it was for an insurance company. I think that's what it was for. Anyway, they had a whole series of these ads, but the punchline was always the same, that you should make sure you had really good insurance cover for the most important person in the world. And you're sitting there thinking, oh, it's going to be my family, it's going to be my children, it's going to be my wife or my husband. And the answer is you. Make sure you've got good insurance company cover for the most important person in the world, you. That's the antithesis of a Catholic worldview. The idea that the best thing a person can be is focused on his or her own needs, self-reliant, independent, able to stand on his or her own 2 feet. that's profoundly opposed to the spirit of the gospel, where the spirit of the gospel says we belong to each other, we're responsible for each other. The welfare of one is the welfare of all. We need to be thinking about each other when we're making our decisions. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about a Catholic worldview, a way of understanding what human beings are all about, what their relationships are meant to be all about, what it means to be in relationship with God and with each other. These are the things that I think need to inform everything about a Catholic school if it's going to be a really good Catholic school. And the last thing that I would say is this, well, second last thing. In the end, I think the Catholic Church continues to support Catholic education, to invest in Catholic education, to encourage Catholic education, to try and expand Catholic education, is because we believe that our children, your children, deserve the very best education they can possibly be given, and an education that excludes the spiritual and religious dimension will only ever be an incomplete education. And who would want to offer their kids an incomplete education when you could offer them a complete education? If I had to sum it up, that's what I would say. And I think that's why so many parents who perhaps aren't particularly committed to the church and perhaps don't go to Mass on Sundays and perhaps may not be Catholic, still want a Catholic education for their children because of that whole environment which the Catholic thing creates in a school. So I had a whole lot of notes. I haven't really followed them very well. But I think I'd like to leave it there and simply say, in relationship to the question with which we started, Catholic schools, what's the point? I think the point is that parents who choose Catholic schools want the best education they can provide for their children, and they believe that that must include the spiritual and the religious dimension as an integrated part of the whole thing. Not as a separate little thing that's boxed off in one little corner called religious education, but is part of the whole understanding of what it means to be a human being, to use the words of Jesus, living life to the full. So for what it's worth, that's what I think the point of Catholic education is. Thanks a lot.
We are now into a situation of, are there any questions that anyone would like to put to the Archbishop? If you would, you can use this to do so. So feel free, feel comfortable. Is there anyone wish to just indicate with your hand? Yes, okay. If you could start with your name, that'd be great.
Hi, my name is Natalie. Great anticipation now for the microphone, but seemed a good idea at the time. I went through Catholic education, not at John 23rd, but with the Mercy Sisters at Santa Maria in a Catholic primary school. And religious education was a big part of my schooling experience. But I'm interested in recent years that religious education has become a marked subject at the used to be TE in my time, but
yes,
now, because they call it now wacky or waste my children.
Year 11 and 12.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, yes.
And I just, I'm not sure if that was an initiative of yourself. I actually was living in the East Coast when that was introduced, but whilst it was very much a part of our education, it wasn't something that was assessed. And I just wondered what your views were on that.
Yes, look, it wasn't my initiative. It was an initiative that I think Archbishop Hickey probably introduced. It's a very common thing around Catholic education in Australia. It was the reality also in Melbourne when I was living there and teaching there. Even when I was teaching Year 12 RE, so that would have been in 1980, 1988, 89. Even at that time, the senior students did a Year 12 RE subject which counted towards their university entrance. So it's been around for a long time. I think there are a couple of reasons for it. The main one is that we want to give the message to the students that this subject needs to be taken as seriously as any other subject. And that's part of the I think it's one of the flow-ons, if you like, of the kind of thing that I've been saying. Religion's not that added extra thing which you tack on at the end, or you can pick and choose if you want to, but it's not really at the heart of the school. I think it's a way of saying, primarily to the students, but then also to the teachers, that this is actually a key part of what being in a Catholic school is all about, because we see this as an essential part of really forming young people to take their place in the world. If we don't treat it as seriously as everything else, we're giving them the wrong message about it. So that would be my understanding of it.
Thank you.
Can I just say, earlier this year I did a seminar for the Year 12 students in our schools. It was during the last holidays, I think, who were doing these units in RE. And we had it at, where did we have it?
Arundel.
That's right, at Arundel. And the place was packed with these Year 12 students, and it was most impressive, the quality of the questions that they asked. So one of the things, doing the Year 12 units at that sort of academic level means that they have to engage with it in the same way that they're engaging with other subjects. I was talking to a group just recently and saying one of the problems with our Catholic faith for many of us is that sometimes, we grow and we develop and we mature, and everything hopefully goes along a good solid developmental line. But we're faced with the fact that we have many adult Catholics who are adults in every respect, except that they're still operating with a grade 6 understanding of their faith or a year 8 understanding of their faith. So we've done them a real disservice because they haven't been able to grapple with these really important questions, these faith questions, and they don't have the tools they need to grapple with them in the way they grapple with other issues. So for all of these reasons, that's why it's so important. Yeah.
Okay, that's anyone else like a question?
One of the problems, I suppose, with Catholic schools is kind of like a tripod, the education of parents of the primary educators oftentimes are not terribly interested in the religious side of it anyway. Catholic schools are, I suppose, the cheaper of the public, of the private schools. But that's a good thing also, that the people who would normally not come to a Catholic school do come to a Catholic school. And often they don't attend Mass or be part of the parish as well. So the schools themselves are left alone to carry this faith, which is very difficult. The comment I'd like to make is that as a child develops its faith, to continue on in adulthood, the developers of that child's faith also must be continuing their faith development too.
You mean the teachers?
The teachers, yes. But also to encourage the parents as well. We have a post-confirmation program in Mirrabooka that I wasn't very happy about because my son went to it and I thought it was a bit iffy and he didn't like it. But now I see there's a fantastic fruit from that. It's wonderful because he also plays footy and he comes home from the footy and that's it. But he comes home from that and he's either angry or something or other, but there's something happening.
Yes.
Anyway, I won't hold you up too much.
Look, when I said at the start that I'm very alive, I think, to a lot of the challenges of Catholic education, the sort of thing you're talking about, I think, does represent one of the challenges. For example, and I've said this a lot, and it's Kath was talking about the launching of this way forward that we had in the cathedral during the week. One of the things that I said there was that we're experts in Perth, in Australia generally as a church, we're experts in the education of children and young people. We're not so good at educating adults, if I can put it. Even that sounds a bit presumptuous or pretentious or patronising. We're not so good in helping each other grow and develop in our faith. That's true generally. It becomes particularly problematic when it's the case for our teachers, because our teachers are the ones to whom we entrust our children, also as regards the education in the faith. And often our teachers, and it's not their fault, aren't well steeped in the traditions of the church, perhaps themselves are still operating with a very kind of childish understanding of the faith. So one of the big challenges we have is, I think, how we can help our teachers, first of all, appreciate that this is a part of their responsibility. And I don't mean that in a kind of a threatening way, but it's just teachers are dedicated and committed people. They want to do the best for the kids. So if they understand that doing the best for the kids also means making sure we help them in this area, then they'll do it. So we've got a lot of work to do there. I think you're hinting at another issue that's a big, big issue for me. It doesn't relate so much to a school like John the 23rd, although to some extent it does. But I go to a lot of schools and I sit down with principals and with the leadership teams and I go around to a lot of parishes and I sit down with the parish councils, and the constant lament, certainly in the parishes and with the parish councils, is we have a school and there's, I don't know how many families in the school and we never see them in the church on Sundays. And that is an issue. One of the things that I think we need to do, and it's a challenge for the schools, and I think particularly for primary schools more than secondary schools or even schools like this, which are sort of primary and secondary, is to rediscover the link with the parish. Because this is a bit of a generalisation, and therefore, of course, it's a bit, it's not all that accurate. But if a child or a young person associates church with school, if the only experience the kids have of church is school, finish school and you finish church. So it's not being grasped, it's not being understood as something that's important for me, living my life as richly and fully and as happily and fruitfully as I want to. So we've got a lot of work to do in that area. And I think that school principals will often say to me, "Where's the church for our people?" And that's the reality. But I don't think we should just say, well, that's the way it is, and we're happy with that. That's great. That's not an ideal situation. So I think schools have as part of their mission, Catholic schools, not in any way to browbeat people or blackmail them, I'm not into that sort of thing at all, but to try and find ways of helping the families see the value of belonging to the Christian community. Now, it's easy for me to say that, it's not easy to find ways to do it, but I do think it's very important. And could I say one last thing? One of the things that a bishop is supposed to do is present the ideal. You know, and I think I've often said this, that one of the things that's very characteristic of the Catholic approach to things, it's not unique to us, but it's very characteristic of us, is that the church sets very high ideals. And the church doesn't believe it's in the business of watering down those ideals. So we've always got an ideal that we're striving for. But the Catholic tradition, particularly because of its sacramental basis and its focus on reconciliation and all those kinds of things, is very realistic about the fact that there's normally a big gap between the ideal and the reality. And if the reality is that I'm here and the ideal's over here, I'm not going to get from here to here in one jump. I'm going to have to take little steps along the way. So there's a kind of an idea in the church that as long as people know what the ideal is and are doing their best to achieve it, even though they're struggling and they may never achieve it this side of heaven, as long as they know that that's what we're aiming for, that's what we need to do. And I'd say exactly the same about a school. and certainly about a Catholic school, in terms of all the things I've been talking about. I've described tonight the perfect Catholic school, and there's no such thing. And I often say to teachers and principals when I go around, don't panic because you're not there yet. None of us are there yet. Just don't compromise on the ideals, but don't think you're going to get there tomorrow. And I think that's a very important kind of mindset to bring to anything in relation to our faith. Because if all you have is the ideal and you're constantly faced with the fact that you're not there, it can just become discouraging. But as long as you understand that our task is to be continually on the journey, that's the important thing. So.
Okay, we've got time for just one or two more questions.
Hi, I'm Gemma. Mine's not really a question, mine is just a comment that I want to make. I've been teaching religious education for 30 years, primary and secondary for at least, 15, 18, something years. One of the things that, like you were saying about asking why did it become an examinable, an assessment course. Back in 1997, when I moved into secondary teaching, we moved into what was in a waste course, the beliefs and values course. It wasn't done for an ATAR, get you an ATAR score, but it was to give you points towards your waste. When we moved it from just an ordinary course in the classroom to getting them waste points, it gave the subject credibility. Kids actually saw it as, well, this means something. They didn't register until later on. And I can't tell you how many students in Year 12, and even when they came back, when I saw them a couple of years later, that actually apologised to me for their behaviour in the classes. And I mightn't have taught them. I was head of RE, but they apologised because it didn't register with them when they were at school. But what we did, we planted a seed. And now, teaching not this year, but I have been teaching the waste course and being a waste marker and things like that. I think what you said, it gives them that opportunity to see it as, it is a course that can be really discussed, argued, and they can really, again, see more credibility. The important thing, though, is the teachers and whether they can allow students to argue, to really, because they want questions, they have great questions, and lots of teachers can't allow them to have those questions, and it's a real skill, and you have to, and I'd be worried if the kids aren't questioning in the classroom. If we're expecting them just to take on board everything, it's a worry. Because at this age, 16, 15, 16, 17, they need to be questioning. They need to be working out for themselves. What is it I believe in? What is it that they're doing? And I just think that's really important. And I do think the course does give us that opportunity to do that.
Thanks for that. And I think it kind of, in one way, leads back to the point I was making before about one of the big challenges for us is to find ways of equipping our teachers so that they would be comfortable in that. If you're fairly well versed in the tradition and you have your own stance about it and it's basically in harmony with the church, you don't feel threatened and you can engage in the discussion. I'm very fond of a phrase that Pope Benedict used to use very often, not in relation to teaching Year 12, but in relation to the church teaching, and proclaiming its message. He said, the job of the church is to propose endlessly, but never to impose. And I think that's a very useful kind of thing to keep for teachers as well as all the rest of us to keep in mind. It's not our job to impose, because if religion and faith isn't something that is freely chosen and freely arrived at, then it's a false kind of faith anyway, or an empty kind of faith. But we have to keep proposing. Yeah.
And when you raise, those contemporary issues, and particularly the same-sex marriage one, students today, I can say, even in the last 4 or 5 years, teaching RE has changed again. Teaching students has changed. It's always evolving and that. And, in our classrooms, the chances are there are going to be students who are questioning their sexuality. And we have to be able to listen to them. We've got to be able to hear them. You try and get them to understand where the church is from. And again, it's not that imposed.
It's proposed and explained, but yes.
But letting them journey, they've got to,
Yes.
they're on a journey.
Yeah. It reminds me of something else that perhaps might be worth saying. I think you say, RE's changed in the last few years, and I think that's absolutely true. But it often leads me to reflect on my own situation. So as I said at the start, born in 1954, grew up in the 60s, good average Catholic family, sent me to Catholic school. So the values that Mum and Dad were on about at home were exactly the same as the values that they were on about at school. But the thing that was different then from now is that the values of the society in which we live weren't that different from the values I got at school and the values I got at home. That's what's changed. And that means for the church, we're in a new situation. We can't just pretend it's business as usual. And that's why the popes are always talking about, this new evangelisation, finding new ways and all the rest of it. Because the context is different. You wouldn't expect the popes to be changing church teaching every 5 minutes. But what they will say is that whilst the teaching at its core stays the same, the way in which we get it across has to change because the context is different. And we could spend hours sort of dissecting the nature of the context in which we find ourselves today and then trying to work our way through, well, how do we now deal with this new context? I think that's one of the biggest challenges the church faces today. But I think I think it's a good insight that this is the major difference, certainly for people of my generation, that there was a more or less a harmony between homeschool and society in terms of values. That's not the case anymore. So that's a challenge. And of course, we all live in the society in which we live. And I happen to think we live in a fantastic part of the world and a terrific society. So I'm not one of these sort of negative people about everything. But everybody, all of us, we can't help it. We just breathe in the atmosphere in which we live and take in almost often unconsciously and unreflectively all the values that are out there. And we never perhaps stop and really think them through. I often say, this is a completely different kind of thing, but it might make the point. I often say to our priests when I'm talking to them, we have so many priests who come from overseas. And there are often concerns raised about this and the difficulties around language and cultural expectations and all the rest of it. And they're all legitimate. But I say to everybody, look, the challenge for us is not to say that a priest from India has to adapt to the Australian culture or that kind of thing. It's that we all have to learn to have our own culture challenged by the gospel culture. The church should be on about the gospel culture, which goes back to those things, gospel values I was talking about before. So the big challenge for us is not to say the priests from overseas have to learn to be like Aussie priests or something like that, or people who come to the parish have to learn to be like our parish used to be when it was all Anglo-Saxons. We all have to ask ourselves, is the way we're conducting ourselves and relating with each other and treating each other, is it in harmony with the gospel culture? Because there is a gospel culture. There's an Australian culture, there's a Samoan culture, there's an Indian culture, there's a Filipino culture, there's a German culture. They all have to be prepared to be challenged by the gospel culture. So we're getting into a whole other theological area here. But it's one of those really big challenges we're facing. How do we make sure we're on guard and healthily, not negatively, healthily critical of the cultural presumptions that operate in our society, because they're not always in harmony with the gospel. Big challenge.
How do you go about,
Sorry.
the thing with the teachers, we have so many needed teachers coming out of school.
Yep.
And like I was saying, you know, what they're teaching in the classroom, or their views and their values, the societies are different. When our kids are going, one reason we send them to a Catholic school is because that doctrine, the tradition, we want all the teachers to be on harmony. And there's a lot that aren't saying and doing what we would expect them to be saying and doing. What is the diocese or schools or doing about that to make sure the teachers are singing from the same hymn book that we want to be singing at home? We understand society is different, but if I'm singing to a Catholic school, I want them to be given the same, you know.
Yep. And I would say, and I'm not trying to avoid this issue, but I would say that's a good example of what I said before about the ideal and the reality. I agree with you completely. That's the ideal. That's what we should be working towards, and that's what we need to be thinking strategically about in relationship to the situation in which each school finds itself. That's what we're working towards. But if we demanded that, say, here at John the 23rd, only those people who were fully on board, 100%, with all of the Catholic teachings in every area could teach in this school, we'd have to shut the school tomorrow. We'd have to shut every school tomorrow. That's just the reality. I'm not saying it's a good reality, but I am saying that it's the reality. I don't think we should shut all the schools tomorrow. I mean, where else would we have the opportunity to have, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of young people go to our schools, and for all of their faults, they are still schools that are grounded in the Christian community, in the Christian message and Christian values. Where else would we have the opportunity to influence in a positive way all of those young people if we didn't have our schools? So the schools, as they are with all of their faults, are already a wonderful evangelising tool. But then by no means perfect. And the sorts of things you're talking about, I think, are the ideals. And that's why I talk about the importance of adult faith formation and the ongoing formation of our teachers. You know, and certainly, if someone is going to teach RE, they do so, as I said at the start, in a school that is a work of the church, and therefore their obligation is to be faithful to the body that employs them. But you know, this is what we're hoping for. This is what we're aiming towards. We're not going to achieve it tomorrow, but because it's hard, we shouldn't give up. I think it's when we give up that we're in real strife.
Grace, sorry, could I just follow on from there? I had the privilege once to listening to one of our past students, a very successful professional past student who came to talk to our students, and he was actually inspiring them about success and academic and everything else. And then slowly he went on to say how he was an absolute faithless student when he was at the school. Religion was a joke. You know, he used to mock it. He loved the green lawns and the beautiful buildings. And he thought, I'm going to go to uni, get my degree, become successful, make money, drive nice cars, go out and night clubbing, and he did all those things. And then he explained to the students also how there came a day when he felt very empty and he had all these material things, but he just wasn't happy. He found a girlfriend, got married, had children, and all of a sudden started realising that he was raising his children saying things that in his mind he remembered were words that were said at the school. Be loving, be respectful, be people for others, don't be selfish, which then led him to go, I think I need to investigate my faith a lot more. He became a lot more dedicated to his faith, and then all of a sudden he had a better relationship with his wife, with his children, and so forth. And like he said to the kids, he said at the end of the day, you'll be surprised how much hopefully will come back one day and you'll hear those words. You might not pick it up at the time, but there will be some sort of a foundation for when you leave. And it was one of the most inspiring things I've heard from a past student. So you just never know.
You know, I'm glad you said that. Something else that's quite interesting is the number of schools I go to where I hear about, 3 or 4 of the teachers joined the RCIA program and were baptised at Easter. Or some of the senior kids, happens at Mercedes occasionally when they come to the cathedral, who want to be baptised. The schools have this quite remarkable evangelising effect. So I think whilst I am very alive to the challenges and the difficulties and the imperfections, if you like, of our Catholic school system, I remain convinced that, and this is putting it too baldly, but if I had to have a choice between having the system we've got, imperfect as it is, or not having the system at all,
Exactly.
I'd opt for the system every time.
Well, even experience with current students, sometimes you hear them say, oh no, I'm not Catholic, I'm not faithful, blah, blah, blah. But then you hear them talk, you hear the way they act, you see how kind they are, they raise money, and you look at them and you say to yourself, I say, my friend, you're more Catholic than what I am, but you just don't realise it yet.
And they are young people, and faith is something that grows and develops with you as you grow and develop, and so we can't expect them to be the finished product in their faith any more than we can expect them to be the finished product in anything else. I think there's another question.
I'm very pleased to be here tonight, and I do recognise the fact that I am much older than many people here. I think, you've given a very wonderful talk in regard to your own life experience, Archbishop, and the young teachers here this evening, I'm sure have gained just so much from what you have said. There's one area, though, at my age and stage, as I see the broader spectrum, perhaps, and that is one thing that I've always known, and as a teacher, that it is the parents who are the first teachers of and the best teachers of their children. So, I do understand that we do have the Maranatha courses running, and I have been involved with many of those. But even so, the parents who bring their children to the schools, they're not taking their children to the parish. And I think perhaps that they are the ones, as you were saying, many of the teachers have only a primary school level of Christian education or Catholic education, and they need to grow. But by the same token, parents are the ones, as the main teachers of their children, to grow in their education. And I think the more Maranathas and perhaps within a school, I know that Murray runs just different evenings here, because I've been here on different occasions myself, and I phoned Murray because I wanted to know if it was a public lecture, and he said, of course. But as I can see, well, here we are, we have wonderful teachers here and different parents and so forth. But really, I do feel the need with my own children, who actually came through John 23rd, they perhaps, well, even though parents are practicing themselves, as we were in our family situation, that there's not a lot of education for parents. Yes. And as we've all been saying, it's a very changing world. I'm here tonight because I'm trying to keep up with these radical changes. I mean, there's just so much that's happening that didn't happen when I was growing up, or even bringing up my family. I think it's such a changing world, and if there could be more parent-adult education, not particularly from school, but through as a broad, yes, and the way forward was there on Thursday
Oh, right,
evening.
yes. Good on you.
And I was there to represent the Catholic Women's League of Western Australia. It started way back in 1938. We have national meetings starting the 22nd of this month in Parramatta. The motions that have been put to the national are ones that are very concerning, ones that deal with trafficking and so forth and so on. We try to keep abreast and with this changing world, even at our, many of our members in the, particularly Geraldton and Bunbury diocese, are young with their families and children. And I happen to be an older person here, but it's a very changing world. It's very challenging. And I think our Catholic parents or young adult parents, adult people, should have more and more and more ongoing education themselves.
Look, I think you're right, and there's a lot in what you've just been sharing with us. The way forward is this big initiative in the diocese trying to get all of us to think together about how we will move forward. I've established a special working party, a working group, to look at exactly this question about what we can do to provide in all kinds of different ways, because we do already in the diocese provide a lot of opportunities, and you've mentioned Maranatha as one. The difficulty is that they only seem to attract small groups. So what they do is wonderful, but somehow or other what they're offering isn't reaching as widely as we'd like. So the other thing that we're doing is, many of you will be aware of it and probably not so sure about it, but we've tried to shift the preparation for the sacraments, not away from the schools, but plant it more deeply in the parishes. And the reason for that is to try and engage the parents a little bit more. We have a new online initiative that one of our priests is putting together to provide simple tools for parents to use at home to educate their kids about the sacraments. And of course what we're really trying to do is educate the parents about the sacraments. We're looking at all kinds of things, but I agree with you completely. It's the big challenge, and we just have to keep working at it. It's the ideal that we're working towards. But I'm grateful that you raise it, because it is almost the key issue. We think of issues in Catholic education and we immediately think of the kids, but in many ways one of the key issues is the formation and training of our teachers. So thank you for that.
That's the conclusion of the night.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Mary. We're almost done.
Sorry I've gone on for so long.
You know, teachers can be quite crusty people to deal with. And I can say that, like Gemma, having decades...
Not just that, I do other subjects.
I'm more than... I just said, I don't know whether everyone heard me put somewhere. Yes, that teachers can be quite crusty people.
You want to come up here?
Yeah, no. Can people hear me? Yes. Yeah. And, just that I have been around for a long time in schools, and I feel I can say that. And I've taken a long time to get into promotional positions for various reasons, so I've done the hard yards. And there's always a bit of an understanding that no one quite understands what it's like to be a teacher. We've got this and this and this and this. It's such a dreadfully hard thing that nobody gets it. And I can remember the excitement, Rupert, when you were appointed as Archbishop, because, I was out with teachers and they were so pleased to say that they'd have someone here who really gets teaching. And I think you've shown that to us tonight. And because what you've said resonates, certainly with me, on so many levels. And before I was at John 23rd, and a while ago now I worked in the Catholic Education Office, and certainly I've taught at a number of schools as well. And, I'd go into a mercy school and we hear about Catherine McCauley, and go and we hear about Mary McKillop and Edmund Rice, and here of course it's Mary Ward and St Ignatius Loyola. And schools are special, and each school feels special. But I used to think, really, whether it's Mary McKillop or Ignatius Loyola, there is something really core at the centre of it all, that we're all about the same thing in essence. And I think it's this Catholic worldview that we're talking about. And when I was at primary school, I can remember we used to run up our page, and on the one side of it we put AMDG, and on the other side we put Jesus, Mary and Joseph. And AMDG for us was always all my work done for God. And that's what I was certain all AMDG stood for. But of course it was only in coming to John 23rd that I hear and you have to tell me what the Latin was.
As Maiorum Dei Gloria.
And for the greater glory of God. And in a school like John 23rd, that's very much caught up in the idea of the marges, which is, doing more for Christ and then for others. So, that little seed that was planted for me with the AMDG back when I was 7 or 8, we've talked tonight about, the maturation of faith and so on, is now coming to life really in John 23rd with a, that outward thing of doing more for others. And, certainly in terms of the context and the culture of the school, that's a challenge for us, I think, now as members of the John 23rd community, to pick up this whole idea of this Catholic worldview, which for us is expressed in an Ignatian perspective, centred around the marges and so on. And perhaps, just finishing with our college mission statement about being people of conscience, competence and compassion, committed to God and the service of others. And I think if we were at other schools there would be something similar, but certainly for us that's the essence of it. And I suppose listening to you tonight, very much in keeping with what we're about at John 23rd. Of course, but, the essence of it all. So, again, thank you so much. Our challenge is, of course, to be a good school, first and foremost a good school, but committed to God and the service of others. So, thank you very much.